Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, you may think that movement from the back of the hall to the front of the hall to lower the microphone is unusual, but if you have my dimensions, it's not unusual at all. It's become almost a ritual. I would be very ungenerous if I didn't begin by thanking your committee for having me as their guest here for the second time. I think the last time was in '64. It was suggested to me when the invitation first came that what I had to say today might have some relevance to the forthcoming federal election. I thought that people like yourselves who write about this all the time would find that an even more boring subject than usual. So I had proposed to waste time. When I was preparing my thoughts last Friday, I decided to give about 5 minutes to describing what I thought would be Carlton's magnificent victory over Richmond in the semi-final. I was going to give another 5 to describing the virtuosity of Canberra's greatest son, and of that I have no doubt. His name is Alex Jezelenko. But unfortunately, it didn't turn out that way. And so instead of spending 10 minutes on the subject, I... Well, if the tune had been "We Are the Good Old Navy Blues," I could have contributed to it. So, leaving that aside, my only prayer is that you don't treat me as roughly as Sheedy treated Nichols in the last quarter. It was said that I'd announce my own subject, and this is what it is. I want to talk to you about a non-issue in the forthcoming federal election. And if you think it's remarkable, what of course I'm referring to is the fact that Australia's most eminent political correspondents, who are all to be found here of course, have been telling us for the past 2 years that whatever might be the issues in the coming federal event, defence will not be an issue. I don't know enough about the subject of what become issues and how they do become issues in federal elections, either to affirm or to deny the proposition. But I accept it for the purposes of argument. And the question then which I would like to discuss with you is the next question, which has always seemed to me to be the more important question. Do the realities of Australia's defence situation, the actualities of our strategic situation, go away because political leaders of both major parties over 2 years have diffused defence as a political issue? And would the fact that nothing serious would be done in the field of defence over the next 3 years really mean that in the middle of the next decade we would be faced with what I may call unfillable gaps and, from the Australian viewpoint of Australian security, quite irreversible situations? It's that, Mr. Chairman, that I'd like to transact with you today, to put before you a few preliminary thoughts as the basis for your questions and your submissions. I can't answer the second question without attempting to give my impression of the first, and my answer in relation to the first question is in the negative. Whether it is in relation to defence or any other reality, reality does not go away because people don't look at it. And if I may get a little more philosophical, reality is not really a function of politics. Politics ought to be a function of reality, although mistaken decisions in the political field in the end create new and unfortunate realities of their own. Now, if I can bring the philosophy down to practicalities. Reality, as I've defined it, began to change for Australia when the British decided to get out of Southeast Asia. I think that we had something to do with that in the foolish denial of a contribution to British funds which we made in 1966. But that's water under the bridge. And when the second of our great and powerful friends, the United States, faced and substantially faced on its own the great and traumatic experience of the Vietnam elections. But the reality had its catalyst only in 1972 in President Nixon's diplomacy. For things began to change at a quite phenomenal pace as far as we were concerned only after Nixon played his Peking card in February, I think it was, of this year, and his Moscow card, I think it was, in May. And after that, and more important than anything else for us, when Japan, which is and will be by far the most powerful nation in Asia, the most powerful nation in the Pacific, to whom face is much more important than it may be to a European power, and whose face was defaced by the Nixonian diplomacy, made it crystal clear that Japan would no longer be a pliant pawn in the hands of American presidential politics. In this moment, everything began to change. From this, what follows? As I've said, it has been transparent for years that Britain would no longer be a physical power, a power with physical military strength in Southeast Asia. But Britain does retain, quite surprisingly, and only as a result of the propositions put before you by an earlier speaker, Mr. Heath, as a result of his decisions, a residual political influence in Southeast Asia, due entirely to its participation in the Commonwealth Five Power Defence Agreement, which in the last analysis is not important to Britain, not really important to Malaysia and Singapore, but could be of very great importance to Australia. And that card I would not willingly throw away. Of the United States, it can simply be said that they remain one of the two great military powers in the world. They are the greatest economic power in the world. Still, they have nuclear power insufficiency and more to guard against any threat to their own continental mainland, should such a threat ever eventuate, which in any medium future is totally unlikely. But the United States, other than that, in terms of conventional power, has only half the conventional power of the Soviet Union. By this time next year, America's land forces will be reduced by 1/3 compared with the land forces they had 2 years previously. One result of that will be that when the Soviet Union directly or through somebody else intervenes in Yugoslavia, and it is my judgment that it will intervene in Yugoslavia, the Americans will be able to play no more than a passive observation role. At the same time, the Americans have handed back the sovereignty of Okinawa. They have given an undertaking which is very clear in the event not to use Taiwan as a military base, and the value of America's Japanese bases is residual and historical. Again, in my judgment, right or wrong, it seems to me that the Americans now have no alternative, and I would be amazed if they've not already made the decision to take their naval and defence line in the Pacific back to where it was before the beginning of the Second World War, which fundamentally is Micronesia. For if you can't use ultimately Okinawa, Japan, Taiwan, and if the Philippines is in today's situation, there is no real practical and viable alternative. And from the viewpoint of Australia, that takes the American defence line in the Pacific back up to 2,000 miles. What has happened to the United States basically is this, or as it seems to me, it is still a world power with worldwide interests. Until relatively recently, it could defend those interests by absolute military superiority. It can no longer do so. Therefore, it must act, as so many powers have had to act in the past, in defence of their worldwide interests on the basis of a balance of power. And the American balance of power, however it may turn out in years to come, is today inherently unstable. Unstable because the relationships with China on the one side of the Soviet Union are doubtful indeed, and unstable because the once stable NATO pact is today in a position of progressive destabilisation. As a result of all of this, all of Americas in the Pacific, including Australia, face situations which are totally new. And the challenges, I do not use the word threats, threats are things which are immediate, but the challenges of the latter part of this decade and the next decade, these challenges are today totally unpredictable. And this in itself has an enormous repercussion on defence policy, which to me for the 70s is infinitely more important than any foreign policy declarations. Without the acquisition of defence capability, foreign policy declarations are merely pinstripe waffle. In the immediate future, it is to meet the foreseeable contingencies. President Kennedy, as you know, used to say that the objective of defence policy for a major power was to meet the worst foreseeable contingency. Robert McNamara, the worst plausible case. For a nation like Australia, let's break that down a bit because we're a medium power only. The object of defence policy clearly is to meet the clearly foreseeable contingencies. And though not one of them can be predicted with any certainty, there are no certainties, and never were in this field, the clearly foreseeable contingencies seem to me to fall under three main heads in the historical period of which I'm describing, which is the latter years of this decade to the middle years of the following decade. Those contingencies, the major contingencies, seem to me to fall under the head of three developments. Firstly, as a result of the presidential diplomacy, we may ultimately be in for an era of American association with China in order to maintain a balance of power with the Soviet. I do not rate that probability as being very high. For clearly the whole drive of American policy is to reach some kind of agreement or accommodation with the Soviet Union as the major nuclear power for a number of very good reasons, and also for a reason which people are only beginning to discuss, for a raw materials hungry United States to have some access to the raw materials of Siberia. For that reason, that card I rate relatively low. The second foreseeable contingency is something which can develop in the course of the next few years as a result of Mr. Tanaka's visit to Peking. One result of this visit to Peking, which today concerns the Soviet Union very greatly, is that it will not result merely in recognition of Peking, but ultimately that it could result in an alliance between Japan and China. That problem, which today concerns the Soviet very greatly, would of course bode no good for the nations of Southeast Asia. For this would be merely in different terms a revival of the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. For those who say that this development is impossible and unforeseeable, I would merely say that Japan will judge its own possibilities in the light of the very few real alternatives which are open to it. And I would invite this audience to examine the immense versatility of the Japanese people. In a sense, the Japanese people are the most revolutionary people in the world, although they seem to be the most staid and stable. For twice in the course of the last 100 years, revolution in Japan has come from the top, by which I mean that the internal political institutions of Japan have been totally transformed, and that's what a revolution really means, not by disruption from below, but by decision of the men at the top of the Japanese power structure that a total change in political institutions was essential to accommodate Japan to the wave of the future. The first was after 1868, at the time of the Meiji Restoration, the second after 1945 and the defeat by the Americans under the proconsulship of MacArthur. Twice, the internal political structure of Japan was totally changed. And I think it was the former American ambassador, Edwin Reichauer, who told the American people that they should not discard the possibility that Japan ultimately would make such a change in relationship with China, with which it has very great cultural affinity. The third foreseeable contingency, owing to the advanced stage of the only two remaining effectives on the Standing Committee of the Politburo in China, and they are Mao Zedong, who is roughly 78 years of age, Zhou Enlai, who is roughly 74 years of age, is that under some contingencies we may be approaching a period of the decline of the period of Sino-Soviet antagonism and its replacement by a period of Sino-Soviet accommodation. This would have nothing to do with ideology, nothing to do with racial affinity, nothing to do with personal friendship. It would simply have to do with reasons of state which would be impelling on both powers, quite apart from any ideology at all. I don't know whether the Chinese are lying, but what they're saying at the present moment is that Lin Piao, before he was physically liquidated, was in touch with somebody in the ruling groups in the Soviet Union. And indeed, Lin Piao's personal history, going right back to 1959, when he was in touch with Cao Kang in his attempt to set up an independent satrapy in Manchuria, would be some evidence of the likelihood of that proposition. Certain it is that in recent years, many in the ruling group in the Soviet Union have had an itchy trigger finger, wondering whether the moment had come for a preventive strike against Communist China's nuclear installations. And if their hand has been held back, one of the reasonings would be that the two remaining effectives are the men whom I've mentioned. In a very short time, and it must be sometime within the next decade, they must either join their ancestors or in the Christian version, go to their eternal reward, and the problem of the succession is not settled in China. Therefore, it is intrinsically feasible that in the ruling group in the Soviet Union, there would be very real hopes that in that eventuality there might be somebody in China with whom the Soviet could do a deal. These are the major foreseeable contingencies of the total change in the environment in which Australia finds itself. It is a total change in the environment compared with everything that has gone on for nearly 200 years. And it always strikes me that at a time when the environment is so much part of the discussion within Australia, as well as the Western world, that nobody discusses Australia's external environment. One of the results of this is simply that small powers who in the past have based their defence on their alliance with great powers now have no reliable allies at all. And that's got nothing to do with ideology. That is what the communist North Vietnamese have discovered in recent months to their expense. That is what the anti-communist South Vietnamese fear, and that is what neutral Egypt has discovered in its dealings with the Soviet Union. It appears to me, rightly or wrongly, that those small powers who have not the defence and economic capability to make themselves economically, and particularly in terms of defence, if not indispensable, then extremely valuable to their erstwhile ally, must in the end face the possibility that that ally, defending its worldwide interests, cannot do what once it hoped to do for them. That again is part of Australia's environment, and the last part of Australia's environment concerns Australia itself. I simply wanted to suggest that Australia is an immensely valuable piece of real estate in this totally new vacuum which now surrounds us. It's an immensely valuable piece of real estate for two reasons. One reason is strategic and the other reason is economic. The strategic reason is simply that any major power which wishes to exercise a major naval influence in the West Pacific, not the East Pacific, and in the Indian Ocean, will find access and the denial of access to Australia's ports and harbours at the hinge of three oceans a matter of major military policy in the course as the decade develops. We would hope that the United States would always be in the position of being one of those powers. The Soviet Union is already a major military power in the Pacific. In actual terms of displacement and in terms of equipment, it is in naval power almost the equal of the United States. And if the Americans redraw their naval and air line and base it on Micronesia, then the Soviet Pacific Fleet must automatically have greater power vis-a-vis the islands and the nations of the West Pacific area. Already it has taken very slow and tentative steps whose value we can still not fully estimate to lay down some kind of infrastructure in the Indian Ocean. A third power is Japan. It is to my mind quite inevitable that Japan will be such a major naval and air power. I do not believe that the Japanese people could ever afford to allow their lines of communication to their raw materials and their markets to be subject to the veto of others. And finally, although it's very unfashionable to mention China in some gatherings, Professor CP Fitzgerald of ANU, who was by no means a believer in the yellow peril, no means a believer in the downward thrust, has in his most recent book, The Southern Expansion of the Chinese People, simply voiced this thought: you cannot take it for granted that the Chinese people, who by a deliberate diversion of scarce resources have become a nuclear power, will not be a naval power by the end of the century. The second reason why Australia is an immensely valuable piece of real estate is the very obvious reason, the economic reason. As you know, and this is the point which Ehrlich and the environmentalists have made, the world is to greater or lesser degree in an era of raw material shortage. There are only 4 parts of the world in which there are still very heavy and unexploited raw material surpluses. Australia is one of them, with its coal, with its iron ore, with its nickel, with its uranium, with the natural gas and perhaps the oil of the northwest continental shelf. All of this makes Australia a tremendously wealthy prize, particularly in an era of raw material shortage. And my professors, Professor McMahon Bull and others at Melbourne University, used to teach me that wars developed when major powers wanted raw materials and wanted markets and went after them. And in case you feel that there will not be the suitable moral pretext for any major power ever to have these rather dirty thoughts about Australia, let me say that under several heads, our New Guinea policy, our immigration policy, our resources policy, there are ample subject matters for discovering moral pretexts for pursuing real interests. That, to me, Mr. Chairman, is Australia's real environment in the remainder of this decade and in the first part of the next decade. There is one factor in this which, to me, is abidingly important and which has a relationship to the forthcoming federal election, even though for the purposes of the argument I would be ready to admit defence non-issue as a proposition. It is the factor of lead time which ordinary people in Australia simply seem not to recognise. Lead time for Australia simply means this, that in this environment, and granted the totally deficient degree of our defence preparedness at the moment, to meet the clearly foreseeable defence problems of the middle 80s, not of the next 2 or 3 years, not even of the remainder of the decade, but the problems of the middle 80s, which are only 10 to 12 years from now. It takes 10 to 15 years of absolutely intent and dynamic defence preparation in order to accumulate the quantity and the variety of defence capability needed to meet the foreseeable contingencies of that particular time, which is the middle 80s. And if the things are not done in the course of the next 2 or 3 years, and if the things even more were not done in the course of the next 5 years for political reasons, what you do in the middle 80s is to create unfillable gaps and irreversible situations which then it is simply impossible to make up. For there is no way in which you can build a substantial naval ship in under 8 years, no way in which you can get a new plane in the sky under that particular time. If you should decide to develop nuclear power for peaceful purposes so that in 10 years you have the option, there is no way in which the 10 years can be bridged. In other words, our capability to meet the problems of the middle 80s will be decided by the steps which we take in the course of the next 2 or 3 years. And indeed, time has been running against us very fast over the last 2 or 3. If I may, Mr. Chairman, now let's tidy up what I have to say by telling you how, in my mind, this is linked to the forthcoming federal election. May I simply say that the types and variety of defence capability which Australia will need to meet the contingencies of the middle of the next decade, I haven't the time to describe them today, but they have been fully discussed in a small booklet which I published 2 years ago called The Defence of Australia. And I simply have to ask you to take it on faith that this is not a commercial for the booklet and that it's simply there in black and white for those who want to follow it up. But granted those types and varieties, the problem of the forthcoming election seems to me, and the fact that for purposes of debate defence would be regarded as a non-issue, seems to me to be simply to be this. It is impossible for any nation to embark upon a defence policy outside the political context of the political parties and the economic context of the economic situation. Over the next 3 years, the only rational presupposition about Australia's economic context will be that they will be inflationary years. Whatever the political parties may promise, whatever the election stunts and gimmicks may be, I believe that both political parties will, on the issue of inflation, perform in substantially the same way. Such is the weakness of democracy in relation to the besetting problem of inflation. In that economic climate, then, the political ethos of the parties is a matter of very great importance. The political ethos of any Labor Party in any part of the world, and to me it is a sympathetic aspect of their formation, must always be one where, even if there is no ideological pressure about defence within the party, and except in a moment of total war, the bent of the party in a time when you are fighting for scarce resources in the field of public expenditure must be towards education and all of those other things that you put under the general heading of welfare. And in this context, it is extremely important for extremely difficult for any Labor Party, apart from ideological pressures from within, to give defence the degree of priority which, in my judgment, it must have as the central problem facing us in the middle of the next decade. But of course, as Mr. Barnett and Mr. Whitlam know well, there are ideological pressures within the party on these very issues. That is why I readily believe both Mr. Whitlam and Mr. Barnett when they say that national service, which is only one part, not in the present form, but a system of universal service, only one part of the problem of defence preparedness, would be abolished within a few days of the election of their government. As Mr. Whitlam made clear to the Amalgamated Metal Workers Union and others, that would be done by administrative decree. That is why I believe, I note what Mr. Barnard says, and Mr. Barnard believes in defence. And Mr. Barnard knows the political context of defence very well. In his judgment, the abolition of national service would reduce the 9-battalion army to 5 or 6, but General Daly pointed out that it would reduce it to 4, that it would lead to the disbandment of a number of support units, that it would lead to a reduction of the CMF to 19,000 effectives, to the redundancy of 4,000 officers and NCOs, and then to the disbandment of a number of reserve units as well. In this situation, two things would follow. Our land forces would be so diminished that they might as well be abolished in order to avoid any pretence. But under those circumstances, it would never be possible to gain the political consensus, the bipartisan political consensus needed in Australia in order to develop the other types of defence policy as well. I have noted, and I believe, what Mr. Whitlam and Mr. Barnard say about the withdrawal of the Australian battalion from Singapore. The withdrawal of the Australian battalion from Singapore has no military significance at all. But it has a very profound political significance because, in my view, if you watch the procedures which follow on the withdrawal of that battalion, it is in fact the key in the lock of the Commonwealth Five Power Defence Agreement, which alone gives us any political capability to be represented with any effect in a part of the world strategically essential to us, without worrying about Singapore and Malaysia. For on the day on which the Australian battalion came out, so would the New Zealanders. The British would not stay there more than 6 months, and the Malays and the Singaporeans, already dickering somewhat with the Soviet Union, would be given no viable alternative but to come closer to the Soviet in order to get a counterpoise against China, which both of them need because of their internal political problem. Finally, I looked at Mr. Barnard's criticism of the DDL program in the current issue of the Australian Quarterly. That criticism, and above all, the positive ideas which Mr. Barnard suggested in place of a larger number of smaller ships, seems to me, at the end of this decade, to leave us navally very largely unarmed. Under those circumstances, this is a proposition in the light of the quite inevitable problems of the middle of the next decade, which I, as a person, speaking for nobody else, simply cannot accept. Of the Liberals, let me merely say, I've never had any illusions about them. They don't command my affection, they do not command any loyalty, and they do not represent me. I would not have proposed the Defence and Foreign Policy Programme, in the way in which they have proposed it. Much better to tell the Australian people, instead of 3 DDLs, this is the totality of our programme over 15 years, and it will cost you in naval expenditure between $2 and $3 billion over 15 years, so that the manufacturers would have had a motive for gearing up for a program of domestic production, and so that the people would have had the opportunity of the great debate on defence which is essential to the Australian people. Nevertheless, I do know that within the Liberal cabinet there are 2 or 3 as intent on the issue of defence as I would be, that the ideological pressures are not there. They, working on their party, the DLP pushing and prodding from without, have given the beginnings of a naval program. And in my judgment, there is a little better, not much better, but a little better than a fighting chance that that same conjoint action could lead us ultimately to a favourable conclusion. Gentlemen, with Dr. Johnson, and I think with the majority of you, I too believe that the appeal to patriotism is very often the last refuge of a scoundrel. And therefore, what I've said to you is not based upon any concepts of patriotism and not based on any concepts of ideology. It's based on what I believe to be prudential common sense. Because in the last analysis, every one of you is in the same position as myself. You have or will have children and grandchildren. And any man who, in the light of foreseeable contingencies, unwittingly and recklessly leaves his children and grandchildren disarmed against foreseeable contingencies is a very foolish man, and the price of his folly will be paid perhaps not by himself, but by the generations which his action has brought into the world.
Thank you, Mr. Santamaria. We now have roughly half an hour for questions. If it's probably, if I might ask the first question myself, the answer I would imagine won't be a surprise from what Mr. Santamaria's said, but because I was going to ask him who he thinks, and this is part of the defence issue, but only part, and he doesn't, as he suggested, defence is being suggested as a non-issue, but who does he think will win, in practical terms, the forthcoming election, and why?
Mr. Chairman, the only answer that I can give to that question is this. I work within the limits of my capacity, and it's not a very good capacity, to try to win the people that I want to win. But as for tipping who is going to win, I wouldn't have the faintest clue. I couldn't even tip that Richmond was going to beat Carlton on Saturday. On the face of it, clearly the odds are against the government at the present moment. Whether that will be so in the last 2 months before the election, and I think we're now in the last 2 months before the election, is in my judgment in the lap of the gods.
Thank you. Next question, please. Megan Still.
Mr. Santamaria, in your final exhortation, you did omit the term ladies. There are feminists here.
I'm sorry.
Going on what you said today, and also your known opposition to left-wing extremism, do you find yourself, in the terms of current Australian politics, isolated on the side of extreme right-wingism?
Ladies and gentlemen, I've always disliked talking in cliches. I don't know what extreme left means, and I don't know what extreme right means. If you ask, do I find myself in an uncomfortable position, knowing very well that the amount of support for the propositions that I've mentioned is a small minority support in Australia? The answer is yes, and it always has been so. It has never been any different from 1939 to the present day. But if we go on to the next question, do you think that I will change what I have to say in order to get majority support, knowing what you have to say to get majority support? The answer to that is also no.
Laurie Oakes, Melbourne Sun. Mr. Santamaria, if I could change the subject to what a lot of political correspondents do regard as one of the issues of the election. Can you give us your opinion of the leadership capabilities of the Prime Minister and his performance so far since he came to office?
I will answer that question as the Delphic Oracle used to answer, by saying that we are not offered great leadership in either of the major parties, but we've got to do the best with what we've got.
In your basic address, you referred to 2 or 3 members of the Federal Cabinet who you believe were sympathetic to your ideas on defence. Would you care to name them, and would you care to nominate which of them you hope will be the next leader of the Liberal Party?
Mr. Barnes, I hope that what I said was not that 2 or 3 members of the Federal Cabinet were sympathetic to my ideas on defence. What I said was that there were, to my knowledge, 2 or 3 who were as intent on defence as I am. That is a slightly different proposition. And the question of whether I would like to name them and to name a putative Prime Minister of Australia, the answer to that is no. The surest way of destroying the shot would be for me to name it. That would be the kiss of death.
Mungo MacCallum.
Mungo MacCallum, Nation Review. You've rather downplayed your own role in this rather humble way, saying there are only a few people who agree with you and not very much you can do. I think everybody in this room knows that you have certainly in the past and quite possibly still do exercise a great deal of political power. I wonder if you could tell us why you choose to exercise it outside the major political parties rather than put candidates up for the government from the NCC or from people who might agree with you.
The answer to that is a very difficult answer to give, Mr. MacCallum. Actually, as you know, the NCC, the movement as it was in the early days, was extremely active in the fight in the trade union movement. And as you know, it was a strong force within the industrial group movement. And in this way, it was closely linked at all stages with all of those who were prominent in the industrial group field. As a result of the Labor split, they became the DLP. And from that moment, in general, while maintaining complete separateness of organisation, and this is fundamental to both sides, we have thought that the best thing that we could do in the circumstances was to support the DLP. And it seems to us that no advantage would be gained by proliferating parties in order to get finenesses of distinction. If you ask why I myself have chosen this particular road, it's very difficult to describe a mixture of personal, psychological and historical factors in this gathering. But it has always seemed to me that in the struggle to maintain what I believe to be a kind of democracy in Australia, what happens in Parliament is one part of the argument, and what happens in the other bodies, which are almost as powerful as political parties, and sometimes more powerful, in the trade union field, is almost equally important. And the way the cards have fallen, that's, or rather, it is in the way that the cards have fallen which has dictated my choice.
Next, Walsh.
Walsh from Financial Review, Mr. Santamaria. I'll accept your distinction between the NCC and the DLP. For the sake of talking here, that quite obviously there's a lot of arguments to just
yes, sure.
But accepting your distinction and accepting your proposition put in your speech that within any Labor Party, its besetting weakness is preoccupation with welfare matters. Do you still see the Democratic Labor Party as still a Labor Party? And if B.A. Santamaria joined his ancestors, who would be offering the ideological pressure within the DLP or the NCC, which would force the Democratic Labor Party to be preoccupied with what you have so successfully sold it as defence?
Mr. Walsh, in the Garden of Eden, you would have been the serpent, I think. You are tempting me to the cult of personality. It isn't really like that at all. In fact, you say that you accept the distinction for purposes of argument. Let me say to you that when you've got raised money for both organisations, the distinction is more than a purpose of argument, it's a great reality. Defence has not been sold to the DLP. As I said at the beginning, in answer to Ms Stoyles' question, the DLP grew out of the industrial group movement, which was always extremely strong on the defence issue, particularly after 1949. It's part of the basic ethos of the DLP, and it would require somebody to unsell them rather than to sell them when, as you gracefully put it, I join Mao and Zhou Enlai with our respective ancestors. The problem of maintaining the interest of the DLP in defence is not the sort of problem I think that you mentioned.
David Barnett.
I wonder if I could, David Barnett from the Australian Associated Press, I wonder if I could read to you the final paragraph of the most recent book about the movement by Paul Orman, who happens to be present today, and ask you if you agree with it. Let's see. The movement is not dead as a political force. It lives on as a National Civic Council, etc. But its clandestine attentions to vital public institutions, the political parties, the unions, the universities, continue. It seeks to infiltrate all these bodies, and it has widened its field of evangelism so as to save Australia not only from communism, but from atheism, the permissive society, and anarchy. And while the Church officially must disclaim it, and indeed many of the bishops do, the NCC remains a force in the Church and a secret pressure group with the same tactics of permeation as the Communist Party and the right-wing League of Rights with which the Australian political society has still to contend.
Well, I'm glad that Mr. Ormond is here, and so that I can say publicly what I have to say. That's a very good caricature of the NCC. The answer to that is no. It's extraordinary to me that anybody can speak of the secret work of the movement today, when for the past 11 years the secret work of the movement has been conducted among other things, every Sunday afternoon or Sunday night on television, with the correspondence which follows, through News Weekly, where it publicly proclaims its attitudes, good or bad, every week for the last 25 years. It isn't a very secret operation to say that the NCC is active in the trade union movement to try to beat the left coalition. Far from denying that, we assert it, and we think it's a most necessary part of the struggle, and until that part of the struggle is complete, it will be very difficult for the ALP to rid itself of the incubus which has until now stood between it and power.
Bruce Juddery.
Bruce Juddery, Canberra Times. Forgive me, I've got 3 questions to ask. You spoke earlier, Santamaria, of President Nixon and more recently making a visit to China, and yes, we lived out in the cold, or certainly we lost the point as far as the changing international environment is concerned. Would you advocate that Australia do what it can now immediately in terms of China, to recognise China and to enter into a meaningful dialogue with China? That's the first point. My second is that at no time in your speech, as I...
Would you mind if I took them one at a time? Because my danger is that...
He's snuck in again, yes, all right.
I'm not trying to get an advantage in my answer, it's just that I tend to forget the actual impact of the questions if I take them. The answer to that first question is this. To me, the question of diplomatic recognition is not determined by morals, not determined by ideology. It's determined by the practical advantage of recognising or not recognising. My answer to the question would be this. Between now and the election, quite obviously, irrespective of what anybody says, there will be no movement in this question at all. Immediately after the election, if Mr. Whitlam wins the election, there will be diplomatic recognition of Communist China, I would say, within the next week or the next fortnight, whoever may say yay or nay. The issue therefore only arises after the election, in case that the Liberal government wins the election. In that eventuality, my advice would be this. It won't be sought, and I'm quite sure it won't be followed, but it would be this. It would be simply to say, we have not the same pressing reasons of state, which the United States has, which Japan has, and which the Christian Democrats in West Germany may have for the what you call this meaningful dialogue. The wheat bins are empty, and we are not likely to have any wheat surpluses in the course of the next 2 years, which would impose very grave economic reasons for any change in our trading recognition policy. I believe that it's extremely likely that in the course of the next 3 or 4 years, might be less, as what I've called the 2 remaining effectives on the Standing Committee of the Politburo will, in fact, depart from the scene. There is no clear successor. And we may be in for one of the eras of dynastic turmoil, which has very frequently followed these situations in China. In that eventuality, I think that you'll find that ideology will not count in China at all, and that those who are involved in the domestic turmoil may very well decide to try to use Taiwan as a military factor, because it has considerable military and economic strength in that equation. Before we exhaust, we throw away the products of the Taiwan policy, which we have pursued for good or evil over all of these years, I would let that time pass. But if the Liberal government decided not to follow that advice, I would see no necessity to burst a boiler about it.
My second point is, no time in your address, and I was rather astonished by this, did you mention Indonesia. I was astounded that a country of 120 million people, immediately to our north, is thinking in purely military terms, a buffer, if you like, against us and the downward thrust, was ignored by yourself when you were speaking on questions of defence. Are you aware that, and I'm no apologist to the Department of Foreign Affairs, that ever since Dr. Everett's time, Australia has had a fairly successful and active, at the moment particularly active, policy via Indonesia, that there are very serious considerations being given to an active defence cooperation, not an alliance, defence cooperation, whatever, with Indonesia. And do you think that actually has got a part in the international balance, which you didn't or omitted to mention earlier?
You're quite right in asking that question, and I don't know whether I can blame the chairman, but he told me just before, or an hour or so before we came here, that what I had planned actually is a 30-minute talk. The normal routine was to do it in 20 minutes, and I had to do, as what you have to do very often, some very radical editing. And in order to present the broader picture, I just dumped Indonesia out of it. But what you say is quite right. I had no alternative but to do that. In my reading of the situation, defence relationships with Indonesia, whether you want to call them an alliance or whether you want to call them an understanding, are quite indispensable to the future of Australia. And one of the reasons why I wouldn't throw away the Commonwealth Five Power Defence Agreement is simply this, that I've moved around in Indonesia a fair bit in the last 4 or 5 years, and I'm convinced that nobody loves you for your beautiful eyes. Their prospects of trying to get that kind of meaningful defence arrangement with Indonesia will depend very largely on their assessment of how we really stand in the whole of Southeast Asia. And one of my reasons for not wanting the battalion to be withdrawn from Singapore is to have the strongest possible presence in the whole of the region so that the Indonesian card can be played by us with effect. But I'm sorry to say that's part of the 10 minutes that was edited out.
I'll accept that. I'm radically edited and radically edit people. My final point is, you spoke earlier of the besetting sin of democracy via inflation. Do you have any alternative?
No, I have no alternative at all, because as far as I'm concerned, I regard the structure of responsible and representative government, as Churchill said, a very bad system of government with one advantage: everything else is worse. And therefore, since I place politics before economics, we start there. Now, having said that, the great problem is that parliamentary parties find it difficult to the point of impossibility to handle the problem of inflation. Even if the economic measures were agreed, and as you know they're not agreed, the economic measures are divided between 2 groups or 3 groups, largely split down the centre, it would be almost impossible in a political democracy to handle the problem of inflation when it has taken a certain drive, a certain impetus. I don't want to make another speech on the question of inflation. What I meant by that statement, that cryptic statement, was simply that I have no alternative to parliamentary democracy because there is no worthwhile alternative, but this is one of the costs of it.
Rob Chalmers.
Mr. Santamaria, just by way of a forward, the Prime Minister informed us the other day that if it was possible for Mr. Ralph Nader to be a member of the Liberal Party, he would not be admitted. Where would you stand on the general question of consumerism?
I am not a great enthusiast for the what I may call the Ehrlich school, as you may or may not know. But as far as Nader is concerned, I think that that statement is a misjudged statement. On the issue of consumerism, I stand by and large with Nader on the broad principles.
I think Peter Samuel.
Samuel, Mr. Santamaria, I wanted to raise the issue of terrorism as a defence issue. Firstly, a specific question. You've been accused by your opponents of being soft on Yugoslav terrorism, and some of your friends have thought that Newsweekly and the NCC have been soft on the terrorism of the IRA provisionals. Could you comment on those 2 points? And secondly, could you say something about the significance of terrorism as a growing defence threat, and possibly any ideas about how this can be countered by a democratic society?
That would demand an encyclopedia, I'm afraid, Samuel, rather than a simple reply. I'm sorry for myself that you brought the Irish issue in, because I can't say anything that won't add to the number of my enemies on one side or the other. You may or may not know that when the Irish issue did develop, the overriding desire which I had as far as Newsweekly was concerned was that the Irish issue, whatever the rights or wrongs might be, might in Australia be played down at all costs. Because I saw that while it was an issue of life and death to the people of Northern Ireland and on both sides, it could do nothing but fan flames that ought not to be fanned in Australia. And you might have seen, I don't know whether anybody even reads the cursed publication, you might have seen that the columns of Newsweekly were then crowded for some weeks by people on both sides saying we were soft on the other side. But basically, my motive was very simply this. I have very great sympathy, and I'm not saying it with any hypocrisy at all, with both sides on the Irish issue. They're all caught in one of the old Greek classic tragedies. But as far as Australia is concerned, there are flames to be fanned by the use of this on either side. So as far as I'm concerned, in the issue of urban terror, I prefer to leave Ireland out. On the issue of the Croatians, I know very well what has been alleged by Dr. Cairns and by others. I can only say what I've said already. Our position on the issue of the use of violence, urban or rural, in Australia is quite simply this, that any violence by the left and by the right ought to be met equally. Secondly, quite clearly, the Commonwealth Police Force in Australia is not adapted to the new challenge of urban terror. I think that the police forces of West Germany and the police force of Britain is not well adapted to the techniques of urban terror. And clearly, you need some new type of police organisation which is specially adapted to discovering the evidence and sheeting the charge home to where it really belongs. Finally, if I might clear up this Croatian business, I cannot understand why the federal government last week did not proclaim at once a judicial inquiry into the whole of the matter, so that when the Commonwealth Police clearly were, whether their hands were tied or whether they were incapable of dealing with the problem, the matter could then have been raised on at a different level, with a different tribunal. On the techniques of urban terror, whether what we saw at Munich, whether what we have seen in the Middle East, I am inclined to believe that desperate groups, highly educated and highly motivated, they're not ignorant, they're not yoiks, they don't come out of the industrial suburbs where I come from. These are very highly motivated and highly educated products of our universities. I would think that it is very important that this, the doctrine which has become exceedingly popular in the last 10 years, you know, you are entitled to disobey the law of which you disapprove, that there should be some moderation in the constant promulgation of that doctrine. For while you can defend that doctrine in the ivory towers of universities, the consequences of its frequent practice will be urban terror in the end, which you cannot cure. Apart from that, I think that what is needed is in every democratic community a new type of police organisation, and there's nothing original in this, I think the London Economist said it last week, specifically adapted in terms of technique to meeting what is a new problem, but one which will remain with us as far as we can see for the next 10 to 20 years.
No, Brett.
Not that new thing. If we've never put up candidates, and if, as you said, you're not going to see a proliferation of political parties, and as your activities do not include participation within the parliamentary system, does this mean that the NCC has stepped up infiltratory activities within the two major parties and possibly the ALP, as you said, which you think would be also against the government in the next election?
Ms. Pratt, no, the answer that I tried to give, I'm sorry if I wasn't clear enough on it, was simply this. Because of our history, when the Labor split took place and the DLP was formed, we decided as a matter of policy to support the DLP. And that support is quite wholehearted, and it is within the parliamentary structure.
Mr. Santamaria, Tony Thomas from the Age. Could you tell us perhaps whether the funds of the NCC are in a stronger or less strong state than before the 1969 election, and why?
Well, I can't answer as remembering now what they were like at the time of the 1969 election. I would say that they're not in a very strong state. The next meeting that I have is actually a fundraising meeting in Melbourne next week. I would not think that they were much worse in 1969, but we've been working on an overdraft as long as I remember.
Jim Quick.
Mirror newspapers. So the question of rapprochement between ALP and DLP arises periodically. Have you ever been involved in any rapprochement moves yourself personally? If so, which way did you advise? And do you think it's impossible in equations the DLP and ALP ever to get back together again?
It's, Mr. Chairman, I don't know what's possible and what's impossible, just as I don't know, as I said at the beginning, who's going to win the election and why. All that I can say is what my own attitude is and has been. I have always believed, and it's on the record, that the Australian political system is much better if there are two major political parties, a Liberal and or Conservative party and a Labor party of middle-of-the-road orientation, of which the present membership of the DLP should be part, as they were at the beginning of the story. In all the years in which, since the days of the Labor split, whenever this issue has arisen, my voice has always been on the one side, and it is unlikely to change whether you judge the result to be possible or impossible. On the question which you have raised, have there ever been any discussions at any top and meaningful level for rapprochement between the parties in which I've participated? The answer is that as a tertium quid, a friend of both sides of those who were involved, yes, I have, with some people who in the middle 60s were at the top levels of the ALP. And I think that at that moment it would have been possible to bring about unity between both parties except for the voice of one man. We'll leave that to Alan Reid.
Mr. Santamaria, Laurie Oakes again, leaving aside the question of whether the DLP is middle of the road, could I ask you a similar question about the possibility of the DLP and the Country Party linking up, since they have similar views on so many things, but particularly the permissive society and foreign policy?
I don't think, Mr. Oakes, that foreign policy is a central issue. The union situation is a central issue, and on these issues I still hold that the most important thing, if it can be achieved, and I'm not ready to comment on the possibility, is the association of the two forces that I mentioned in relation to the last question. I can see the points of similarity between the DLP and the Country Party. This would seem to me to be a less desirable alternative than the one I mentioned in my reply to the last question.
Could we have a final question? I've got one. So.
Follow the answer that you gave to Melbourne. On this whole question of linking the ALP and the DLP, you're apparently in favour of it. Would it not therefore be more logical for the NCC, or for you in particular, to work within the ALP as other forces work within the ALP to try and get your views, the majority policy of the parties, and let the DLP wither away so this two-party system can come back?
Well, if you will give me a guarantee that somebody won't... that somebody will not then write a book saying that I'm infiltrating the ALP. If you give me a stone cold guarantee of that, then I might look at the proposition. But in terms of historical reality, Mr. MacCallum, what, as you know, before the Labor split, there was no question of the infiltration of the ALP. The action of the movement with the industrial groups and the ALP was initiated by men like Mr. Percy Cleary, Mr. Rex Broadby, Mr. Stout of the Melbourne Trades Hall Council, all of the top-level leaders of the Labor movement. And the result of all of that effort was that those who were associated with us were expelled for their pains. Now, I want still, whether it's possible or impossible, and that I'm not ready to judge, I want still that moderate, middle-of-the-road Labor Party brought about in that way. But as for working in the way you suggest, I think that this is technically and logistically impossible at the present moment.
Could I ask a final question which partly pertains to that? Are you winning or losing in your the movement in the trade unions and the industrial groups? Do you see the situation as much worse as, say, in the late 50s to now, or much the same? Well, much worse than Mr. Santamaria's position, I'm talking.
No, very briefly, and as that is the last question, Mr. Chairman, the situation in 1945 was that the Communist Party and their allies of the extreme left had a majority of 90 at the Congress of the ACDU. I think that figure would be right. They were beaten, barely beaten, I think by a majority of 20. They wouldn't have been beaten at all unless there was rapid emergency action to safeguard the interstate executive immediately after that. And finally, it depended on one single fluke in Adelaide in the election of the South Australian representative. In fact, the fluke happened. As a result of that fluke, the non-communist forces had a majority of, I think, 25 at the 1947 Congress, and that majority increased substantially at the 1949 Congress. That was just before that, you had the coal strike with all of the hullabaloo of Mr. Chifley's intervention on the coalfields. I do invite you all to read, for anybody who doesn't like attacks on communism and calls them McCarthyism, to read Mr. Coolwell's speech on that occasion. It has a degree of virtuosity which nobody's ever been able to equal. But nevertheless, the position was safe and sound until the Labor split in 54. After that, Albert Monk still retained the balance of non-communist forces with a non-communist majority, and when I use this phrase I mean the general alliance of the left coalition until his retirement. But the left coalition began to win just before the 1969 Congress. And finally, as you will recall, when Mr. Hawke was elected president of the ACTU, he was elected with a majority of, I think, 395 to 350, and inside that 395 votes, the whole left coalition force was there and have remained there ever since. The most recent figures at the last ACTU Congress, if you want them, were these, as far as one can establish them by very careful statistical work. There were, I think, 755 credentialed delegates. On this vote, a couple of people were out of the room, but the left coalition had 383. What I may call the non-communist force had 370. That would leave 2 people out of the room, wouldn't it? 370. There's only 13 in it. And I believe that that 13 can be reversed with a bit of luck and work in the course of the next few years. If you ask me, can it be reversed if the force with which I have some connection drops out? My answer is no, it can't be reversed at all.
One more.
What I am at the moment. Can you explain for me why Mr. Hawke is, what do you see as the reason why Mr. Hawke at the moment is coming under very heavy attack from the left-wing unions, the radical left-wing unions, in their publications, the type that were in the group that supported him at the last Congress?
The answer is found in the limerick concerning the young lady of Braga. The problem of Mr. Hawke is the problem of every person who is not a communist, and Mr. Hawke certainly is not, who decides to build his political future on the basis of the political support of the left coalition, because they support you on terms. They support you because you promised to go to a certain point, as Mr Hawke went to a certain point with the power strike and with the oil strike. But then, of course, even if you don't have any split in the communist forces as you have at the present moment, the terms are then that you go the whole way. And at that stage, of course, it's been traditional that the Labor man who doesn't want to go the whole way stops. And immediately, of course, the persons who supported him then say that he's sold out to the capitalist. The problem is made a little more intricate because of the split into three communist parties, but two of which at this moment really count. And the aspect and the impact of that on the attacks on Mr Hawke at the present moment are simply these. Mr Hawke's political base in the ACTU is increasingly the force which is led by Pat Clancy, as you know. And this is the stable and enduring force in the whole gamut of Labor politics, political and industrial. The force led by Mr Clancy, for very good reasons, this is the Soviet-oriented Communist Party, the Socialist Party of Australia, wants everything to be dampened down between now and the elections, for a very clear purpose. And therefore, they don't go along with Mr Ahrens, and let alone Mr Hill, at all in demanding their go-go type of industrial action. On the other hand, Mr Ahrens and Mr Carmichael and Mr Mundy say the election of a Labor government is not the answer to a maiden's prayer. We have got to show that a Labor government must then yield to the demands of the masses, and we are the masses. And of course, at this stage, they see Mr Hawke going along with Mr Clancy, dampening down the fires, and to them seeming to chicken out. Therefore, he faces not only the problem of the ordinary Labor leader who wants to go 75% of the way, and then will be accused of selling out if he doesn't go 100, but he's caught in the crossfire of the split within the communist forces. But I can cheer him up. In 2 or 3 years, he won't have that crossfire in my judgment. In my judgment, only one of those communist parties will count, and I think it's Mr Clancy's Communist Party.
Well, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, as I, being a Monday, overlooked asking one of our committee to move this vote of thanks, I've taken it upon myself. And I'm sure that whether you strongly disagree or agree with whatever Mr Santamaria has said today, that you will agree with me that he is most outstanding speaker and puts his case very strongly and forcibly, and I would therefore ask you by the usual way to show your appreciation.